It is well known that for many centuries the Roman Empire stood tall as a colossus over the European and Mediterranean world, and extended its influence from foggy Albion to the harsh deserts of Mesopotamia. Its incredible power, unprecedented duration of existence, and deep cultural imprint made it one of the most outstanding state formations in human history. Even from its humble beginnings as a city on 7 hills, Rome gradually evolved into a universal power whose legions seemed completely invincible and whose legal and administrative systems were incomprehensible. Architectural masterpieces such as the Colosseum and the Pantheon, engineering achievements such as aqueducts and roads, a deep legal heritage that became the basis for many modern legal systems, and the rich literature created by the Romans still serves as the basis for Western civilization. This was not a sudden collapse caused by a single fatal blow. Instead, it was the culmination of a long, centuries-long process of internal weakening that was eroding its foundations. Historians who have studied this monumental decline for decades have come to believe that it was the result of a complex interaction of many factors. The lack of a single, universal cause for the fall has led to many theories, but most agree that Rome fell not from external pressure, but from internal illnesses. In this video, we will take a detailed look at 5 key problems, or more precisely, systemic errors, which, intertwined and reinforcing each other, gradually led to the destruction of the western part of the Roman Empire. These errors, which were both fundamental economic miscalculations and deep social and cultural transformations, the historical process is very complex and multifaceted. It shows that even the strongest and most influential structures can break down due to internal problems. These examples give us important lessons about how even the strongest states can be vulnerable. They show how important it is to be able to change, to reform in time, and to analyze your mistakes. We will look at each of these key issues in detail to understand how they gradually weakened the Roman Empire and what ultimately led to its fall, an event that changed the map of Europe and had a major impact on world history, while creating new cultural and political conditions. Now we come to the first mistake, which was severe economic instability, and it was aggravated by colossal government overspending. Rome, at the height of its power, functioned as a huge machine for absorbing and redistributing resources, but this machine became increasingly inefficient and wasteful over time because it began to consume more than it produced. The main reason for the financial difficulties was the incredibly large military expenditures. Maintaining a massive army of hundreds of thousands of legionaries and auxiliaries was critical to protecting the country's vast borders and suppressing internal rebellions. But maintaining this military machine, including paying soldiers, providing food and provisions, building fortifications, manufacturing weapons, and waging constant campaigns, required staggering sums of money that continually exceeded the state's revenues. Victories, while sometimes bringing in spoils and new taxpayers, rarely offset the costs of decades of constant warfare, continent-wide logistics, and a massive bureaucracy. In its early days, the army brought in wealth by capturing new territory and receiving special levies in the process. To cover the chronic deficit, the rulers resorted to the practice of currency devaluation, which was a real economic suicide. At first, this manifested itself in the fact that the coins, denarii and auri, were reduced in the amount of precious metals. This was a sign of economic problems and the weakening of the state. Silver and gold coins, which were once famous for their purity and stability, gradually turned into symbols of past wealth, being filled with copper or bronze. By the 3rd century, the silver content in the denarius had fallen to 5%, and gold coins became a rare occurrence. This process, which began under the emperors of the Severan dynasty and reached its catastrophic apogee in the 3rd century, led to rampant hyperinflation. Prices for basic goods and services skyrocketed. The purchasing power of money fell rapidly, making long-term planning, trade, and capital accumulation impossible. For example, the cost of some goods could double in a few months. Farmers, unwilling to sell their crops for devalued coins, chose barter. This further disrupted trade and monetary relations. As a result, the economy became natural. People increasingly exchanged goods directly, without money. This situation slowed economic growth, reduced the number of taxes, and eventually led to the emergence of closed regional economies. All this ultimately weakened the single market of the entire empire. In addition, Rome's economy was heavily dependent on slave labor. While slavery provided cheap labor for agriculture, mining, construction, and other industries, it also suppressed incentives for technological innovation and the development of production methods. People did not understand why they should invest in new, more efficient tools or technologies when they could always bring in new slaves from conquered territories. Therefore, the lack of pressure to invest in increasing the productivity of free citizens led to technological stagnation in key industries. When the era of large-scale conquests came to an end, the influx of slaves decreased significantly, and the economy faced an acute labor shortage without having developed alternatives or incentives to move to new production models. This also prevented the emergence of a large layer of free people, those who could produce goods and buy them for money. Because of this, the internal market did not develop, but on the contrary, it became smaller and weaker. It is also worth mentioning that the ineffective and unfair tax system further aggravated the economic problems. The main part of taxes fell on the poorest strata of the population, peasants, small artisans and traders, who already could hardly feed themselves. It was especially hard for residents of the provinces, where taxes were very high and greatly complicated their lives. Rich landowners and influential officials, having enormous influence, connections and access to power, often found ways to avoid paying taxes and/or significantly reduce their obligations through bribery, corruption, and the use of loopholes in the law. This also led to a decrease in the treasury's income, aggravated social inequality, and caused deep discontent among those who honestly paid taxes, feeling oppressed because of this. The tax collection system was unreliable and unpredictable. Taxes depended on the mood of the collectors and were often opaque. Because of this, the state could not consistently receive money for important needs. This situation caused frequent uprisings. People protested against the heavy tax obligation. Finally, Rome suffered from a significant trade imbalance. The empire imported huge amounts of luxury goods from the east, such as fine silk from China, rare spices from India, jewelry, exotic goods, and expensive raw materials, which it paid for mainly in gold and silver. At the same time, its exports such as wine, olive oil, metal products, and some handicrafts could not always cover this large decrease in money. Because of this, gold and silver were constantly leaving the treasury and ceased to play their role in the economy. Although Rome was the center of a large trading network, the wealth from its conquests long hid serious internal problems. The constant outflow of gold and silver only increased the depreciation of money and created an acute shortage of the living funds needed for the normal functioning of the economy. Merchants increasingly traded with the East because they could get reliable and hard currency there. This further weakened the economy of the western part of the empire. The consequences of this economic decline were widespread and even devastating. The decline in the standard of living of the population became a widespread phenomenon. Many citizens, especially in the large cities, faced extreme poverty and hunger. Small landowners, unable to compete with the large latifundia or bear the tax burden, were forced to sell their lands and seek refuge in the cities, where unemployment and social destitution awaited them, further increasing urban poverty and dependence on the state. Ultimately, this led to a decline in agricultural and handicraft production in general, since trade and agriculture became less profitable and more risky. Therefore, many cities, deprived of their economic base and population, gradually fell into decline, their infrastructure collapsed, and public life came to a standstill. The state, deprived of stable and sufficient income, was unable to finance even the most basic needs, including the maintenance of an extensive road network and, most importantly, an effective defense, which was critical in the face of increasing barbarian pressure. This, in turn, led to increased social unrest, riots, and increased general instability, undermining the population's faith in the central government and its ability to ensure order and prosperity. Rome constantly sought to expand its borders for glory, new resources, and protection from enemies. This desire led to the creation of a vast empire that occupied lands on 3 continents and was millions of square kilometers. However, this territory eventually proved to be a huge problem, making it almost impossible to effectively control and protect the state with the help of the then means of communication, transport, and administration. From the deserts of North Africa to the cold mountains of Scotland, from the Atlantic to the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, the Roman Empire spanned vast and culturally diverse territories. Ruling such a vast empire was like trying to steer a gigantic ship from a small boat, without navigation or communication. I would also like to say that the remoteness of different parts of the empire and the great distances created enormous difficulties with management and supply. The transfer of troops, food, equipment, as well as the movement of officials and the transmission of decrees required time and resources. Messages from Rome to the borders of the empire could take months, and this in turn made it impossible to quickly respond to problems. Any delay or disruption in supplies could lead to serious problems on the ground, from hunger in the army to the inability of provincial administrations to function. It is therefore obvious that this situation made the empire very vulnerable to any disruptions, be it bad weather, bandit attacks, or internal rebellions. The further a province was from Rome, the weaker its control became. This interfered with centralized control and led to local rulers or military governors acting almost independently. In some places, this even caused a desire to separate from the empire. It should not be overlooked that there was a great diversity of cultures and peoples that Rome absorbed during its conquests, and this became another serious problem. Peoples with different languages, Greek, Latin, Celtic, Germanic. Customs, religions, systems and traditions were united under Rome, but their unification was often superficial and incomplete. Although in some provinces and peoples, such as Gaul and Spain, the Roman culture and language took root quite well, not everyone accepted Roman rule. Many retained their traditions, language and customs, felt alienated within the empire, and perceived Roman rule as oppression. This created constant potential for tension, discontent and rebellion, requiring the constant and uncontested presence of the legions to maintain order, which in turn diverted critical resources from defending the outer borders. Rome attempted to unify the empire by spreading its culture, language and customs, a process called Romanization. But it did not always work, especially in distant or newly conquered lands. There, local rulers and nobles often retained their customs and ways of life and only formally acknowledged Rome's authority. In an attempt to somehow cope with this difficult task, the empire gradually applied the method decentralization of power. Therefore, new administrative units were created. Provinces were divided into smaller entities to simplify administration, and eventually, under the Emperor Diocletian in the late 3rd century, a formal division into Western and Eastern empires with 4 prefectures took place. Although this division was initially aimed at increasing the efficiency of administration and defense through proximity to problematic regions, it eventually led to a weakening of unity, and so the two halves of the empire often acted in disarray and sometimes even competed with each other for resources and influence, which in turn undermined the overall power. Each part had its own priorities and problems, and the central government in Rome and then in Ravenna, and so it became increasingly difficult to control the regions, because they were increasingly separated from the center and acted independently. Local warlords began to create their own strongholds of power. They raised troops, made decisions without the consent of Rome, and effectively ruled the territories as independent rulers. There were also small border conflicts, and they became a constant and tiresome problem. The more the empire expanded, the longer and more complex its borders became, and the more difficult it was to defend them effectively. Rome's land borders stretched for thousands of kilometers. It was constantly necessary to defend itself from barbarian tribes, Germans, Goths, Vandals, who were advancing on the Rhine and Danube. In addition, the powerful Persian Empire threatened in the east. Because of this, large armies had to be stationed along the entire length of the borders. These wars were exhausting and very expensive, requiring many people and resources that had to be constantly directed to defend the empire. Each victory ultimately only temporarily delayed the next wave of pressure, and the empire was in a state of intermittent defense that drained its life force without bringing in any new income or territory. A defensive strategy could not compensate for the decline in resources, while an offensive strategy ceased to be profitable. Thus, the consequences of the empire's overexpansion were complex and even destructive. Military expenditures to protect the borders became too great for an already weakened treasury. Control over the provinces was weak, which allowed corruption and abuse to grow everywhere. Governors and officials often used their power for personal gain, taking bribes and imposing excessive taxes. All this was aggravated by the fact that there was no strict control over them. It should not be forgotten that this further increased discontent and weakened loyalty to Rome, undermining the economy and public morale. Uprisings at that time and separatist movements, such as the Bagaudae revolts in Gaul and Spain, broke out in remote regions, requiring the central government to divert troops from more critical areas of defense. These rebellions were very expensive and bloody. They undermined morale within the empire and showed how divided it was from within. The resources of the main region, Italy, which had previously been the center and source of wealth, began to decline. Italy gradually became a backward region without investment and labor, because all the energy and money went to supporting the large but poorly governed outskirts of the empire. The creation of two empires, the Western and the Eastern, although an attempt to rationalize government, in reality simply weakened both parts, depriving them of the ability to act as a single powerful organism. The Western Empire, less wealthy, less secure, and more exposed to barbarian attacks, found itself in a particularly difficult position, lacking sufficient reserves to withstand threats. Thus, what seemed to be Rome's greatest triumph, its territorial expansion, turned out to be its greatest weakness and one of the causes of its downfall, making it too large to be effectively governed. Well, we have dealt with this factor, so we will further analyze the third mistake, which was corruption and political instability. They became the so-called chronic disease that ate away at the Roman Empire from within, undermined its state institutions and the population's trust in the central government. After the relatively stable period of the 5 good emperors and Pax Romana, the empire plunged into an era known as the crisis of the 3rd century, which became the beginning of its final destruction. One of the main reasons for instability was the frequent and often brutal change of emperors. The throne became a battlefield because the legions proclaimed their commanders emperors, and the rulers were overthrown and killed almost constantly. Troops were diverted from protecting the borders, and the people gradually lost faith in the government. Chaos and uncertainty reigned. Each new emperor, in order to gain the support of the army, spent huge amounts of money on gifts to soldiers, further depleting the state treasury. But the struggle for power was not only between the pretenders to the throne, but also between important groups within Rome itself. The army, the Senate, and the Praetorian Guard all tried to strengthen their influence. To do this, they used violence, bribery, and intrigue. The Praetorians, who were the personal guard of the emperor, had enormous power and often decided who would be emperor. They turned the throne into a kind of auction, where power could be bought for money. For example, after the murder of Emperor Pertinax, the Praetorians sold the throne to Didius Julianus at auction. Now let's talk about corruption, and because it had penetrated all levels of power, from high officials to local employees. Selling positions, bribes, extortion, abuse, and nepotism became commonplace. Officials in Rome and the provinces used their positions not for the state, but for their own enrichment. This not only reduced the treasury's income, for example due to unpaid taxes, but also undermined the trust of ordinary people in the government. They had logic. If the law can be bought or circumvented, then they did not understand why it should be followed. This situation created a vicious circle, because corruption strengthened itself, and state structures ceased to function, turning into an instrument of oppression and profit. Because of this, discontent and alienation of the population grew. There was also the absence of a clear and stable system of succession to the throne, and this was another factor that contributed to political instability. Although some emperors, such as Nerva or Trajan, tried to introduce a system of adoption of the most worthy heir, this method was never fully established and was constantly contested. The dynastic principle also often brought incompetent or unwise rulers to power. This meant that the death of each emperor, even a natural one, could provoke a new struggle for power, many conspiracies, and more civil wars. We know that all this led to the loss of people's trust in the central government. Citizens, seeing the constant struggle for power, chaos, constant corruption, and the government's inability to protect them from external enemies or internal problems, these could be hunger, robbery, and banditry, lost their sense of belonging to the empire. Patriotism used to be a strong force that united Rome, but over time it began to fade. People increasingly withdrew into their local communities and regions, preferring to support local landowners or leaders rather than feeling part of the greater Roman Empire. Civic engagement and interest in public life declined sharply, because political participation seemed either pointless or downright dangerous. The consequences of such political weakness were very serious. The center of power was unable to carry out long-term and necessary reforms, which were vital for the empire to adapt to changes. The emperors were only busy fighting for power and fighting enemies inside and outside, so they could not think about strategic plans or serious changes in the economy, army, or society. The state system was falling apart from within. Instead of working for the benefit of all, it became a source of personal gain for a few and helplessness for the many. Civil society and patriotism began to rapidly disintegrate. People simply did not understand. If the empire could not provide security and justice, why would people defend it or sacrifice for it? Due to constant coups and weakening of the citizens' power, the army became the main force that dictated its terms and placed its people in key positions. Thus arose the so-called military dictatorship, where generals decided the fate of the empire, often for their own personal purposes and not for the interests of the state. Based on the previous era, the next one follows, namely the crisis of the army and the invasion of the barbarians. Despite its legendary reputation, the Roman army, which had once been the backbone of the entire empire, was in serious crisis by the last period. This crisis directly contributed to the fall of Rome. On the one hand, barbarian tribes were increasingly pressing on the borders, and on the other, the army was weakening from within and losing its former strength. One of the main problems was that the army gradually lost its traditional qualities and familiar composition. Used to be legions made up of disciplined and loyal Roman citizens who believed in the ideals of the Republic and Empire. But over time they were increasingly filled with mercenaries and barbarians. These allies, called foederati, often came in tribes and settled on Roman lands. They served in the army under their own chieftains, who were given land and status by Rome. However, it should not be forgotten that such warriors had no real attachment to Rome or its culture. Their interests were only material. Their loyalty was unreliable and could easily change if another leader or Roman general offered better conditions or promised victories. They fought not for the emperor, but for their leaders. Also, a very important factor was the loss of discipline, because it was ubiquitous and manifested itself at all levels. Soldiers increasingly robbed civilians, deserted or refused to carry out orders that they considered too dangerous or disadvantageous. Corruption flourished in the army, undermining its combat effectiveness and efficiency. Officer positions were often given not on merit, but on the basis of connections, money, or political support. This further weakened the command and lowered the quality of the entire leadership, and the Romans were increasingly reluctant to serve in the army because of its harsh conditions and danger, so the state began to rely more on non-Roman peoples. The army, which had previously been a symbol of order and strength, now itself became a source of chaos, violence, and instability. The strategic shift from an offensive to a defensive strategy also played a role. Instead of projecting power beyond its borders and conquering new territories that would bring in income and slaves, Rome focused on defending the ones it already had. While this made sense in the context of dwindling resources and a demographic crisis, it also meant losing the initiative and the ability to dictate terms to the enemy. And building large fortifications and defensive lines, such as Hadrian's Wall or the limes on the Rhine and Danube, required enormous amounts of money and men. These resources could have been better used to actively fight enemies. In addition, such a static defensive approach made it difficult to react quickly to barbarian attacks and did not provide the opportunity to effectively pursue them on their own territory. As already mentioned in the section on political instability, the legions were often used not to protect the empire from external enemies, but to support various pretenders to the throne. For example, the famous general Stilicho, who himself was of barbarian origin, was killed by order of the emperor Honorius. With his death, the Western Roman Empire lost one of its last capable and experienced military leaders. At the same time, when the Roman army was going through an internal crisis, the pressure from the barbarian tribes increased significantly. These barbarian tribes, displaced from their traditional lands or bribed by the wealth of the Roman Empire, sought new territories and resources. Their main target was the rich Roman provinces. These tribes were not disorganized mobs. Many of them were able to make complex military plans, thought tactically, and were quick to adapt. They mastered Roman fighting methods and weapons, and sometimes even surpassed the Romans in numbers and speed of movement. Thus, the consequences of the crisis of the Roman army and the increasing pressure from the barbarians were truly catastrophic. The empire was clearly demonstrating its inability to defend its vast borders. The barbarian tribes began not only to raid, but also to penetrate deeper into the territory of Rome, leaving behind destruction, death, and chaos. The plundering of Rome itself became symbolic, first by the Goths, then by the Vandals. These events did not mark the end of the empire as such, but they dealt it a powerful moral and psychological blow. The idea of the so-called eternal city as the center of civilization and order was destroyed, and therefore Rome no longer seemed invincible. But the barbarians not only plundered, but also destroyed infrastructure, roads, aqueducts, farms. The population of cities significantly decreased, villages became empty, agriculture declined. In addition, the barbarians did not simply invade the territory, they directly migrated. Many federates settled on Roman territory lived by their own laws, obeyed their own leaders, preserved customs and language. This gradually destroyed the Roman identity, undermined cultural and political unity. And thus, the weakness of the army and the pressure of the barbarians became a deadly combination. The Roman Empire was losing not only lands, but also its essence. Ultimately, it could neither effectively defend itself nor recover from the blows that led to the destruction of the Western Roman Empire. Well, we finally get to the last mistake of the Romans for today, and it was in radical social and cultural changes. These internal changes, although almost imperceptible than the barbarian invasions or political upheavals, but they were no less, and sometimes even more destructive, because they undermined the very soul of the Roman state and the will to survive. We know that one of the fundamental reasons was the weakening of traditional Roman religion and the values associated with it. The ancient Roman pantheon of gods, the cult of ancestors, state rituals, and the cult of the emperor, which were once the basis of public morality, a source of patriotism and a powerful element of unity, gradually lost their significance and authority. Participation in state cults, previously considered an integral part of civic duty, became a formality. They were replaced by new cults, mystical teachings, and philosophical movements that offered a more individual path to salvation, spiritual meaning in life and personal well-being, often ignoring worldly concerns and state interests. The most significant and influential of these was the spread of Christianity. Christianity, with its aspects of the afterlife, the equality of all people before God, universalism, the concept of one God, Christians refused to worship the emperor as a god and advocated peace, which was very different from the Roman views, where the main thing is service to the state and earthly life. The ideas of peace and brotherhood that were important to Christianity were not the same as the warlike spirit of the Roman Empire and could reduce people's desire to serve in the army or sacrifice themselves for the state. The refusal of Christians to worship the emperor as a god undermined the authority of the government, replacing loyalty to the state with loyalty to religion. Although Christianity helped to preserve its unity in the East, it could not completely replace the previous state ideology in the West. There was also a decline in population due to constant wars, destruction, and low birth rates in the cities became a serious problem. According to historians, the population of the empire could have decreased by almost 50%. A labor shortage weakened the economy and reduced productivity. The decrease in the number of citizen warriors made the army increasingly dependent on mercenaries and barbarians. The growth of social inequality should not be ignored either, because it was obvious and worsened with each decade. The gap between rich and poor became ever greater. Aristocrats owned vast lands, while the majority of people lived in poverty and barely made ends meet. Large landowners created independent estates where they had their own private armies, judged their peasants, and actually had separate power, and this weakened the authority of the central government and destroyed social cohesion. City dwellers, who had previously been active participants in political life and the backbone of the republic, turned into passive consumers of state aid, which led to a loss of civic activity and general apathy of the population. Eventually, the people simply stopped feeling responsible for the fate of the empire, since their voices counted for nothing and their interests were ignored. Their loyalty increasingly shifted to local defenders rather than to imperial government, which led to feudalization. And finally, the degradation of education and culture was very noticeable. Interest in classical literature, philosophy, rhetoric, and sciences gradually declined, giving way to more religious interests. Education became an honor for very few, and the general level of literacy and intellectual development declined. Many educated people went to the church or monasteries rather than to civil service. The building, engineering, and artistic excellence that had characterized Rome's golden age gradually gave way to more profitable but simpler forms, reflecting a general decline in living standards and a loss of ambition. Cultural stagnation reflected a general decline in spirit and a loss of the energy that had once helped to find new ideas and solutions. The empire could no longer change effectively and cope with problems. The consequences of these social and cultural changes were profound, even catastrophic. The weakening of social cohesion made the empire more vulnerable to internal dissension, rebellion, and external threats. If people did not feel part of a whole with common goals and values, there was no point in defending that whole. The loss of the idea of the Roman spirit and unity, the same inner strength and identity that had once allowed Rome to overcome any difficulties and conquer the world, became decisive. People could no longer identify with Rome's great mission or its ideals, and the lack of motivation to defend the empire manifested itself in desertion, evasion of service, and general indifference to its fate. Therefore, more and more citizens, especially in the provinces, decided to submit to barbarian rulers who offered more stable living conditions and lower taxes than the Roman administration. And the transition from urban to rural life was another symptom of the decline in quality. Cities, which used to be centers of culture, trade, and politics, were losing their importance, and the population was simply trying to hide in the countryside, away from taxes, wars, famine, and epidemics. This led to the destruction of urban infrastructure and the loss of many achievements of civilization, which eventually turned prosperous cities into ruins. We should not forget about the spiritual crisis of society, which was expressed in the loss of faith in its own values and ideals, and it was the most insidious factor that ultimately broke the Roman Empire, depriving it of the will to survive and the ability to revive. Thus, the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD, which became the symbolic end of a grandiose era and the end of antiquity, was not a quick event, but a complex process that stretched over centuries. As we have seen, the fall of the empire cannot be explained by one cause. It was a complex set of interrelated problems that weakened the state over time. The empire did not collapse suddenly. It slowly faded away, like a sick organism, becoming increasingly vulnerable. But let's not forget that the 5 mistakes we've covered in this video are the main categories that cover the main aspects of decline, which mutually reinforced each other, creating a vicious cycle of degradation. Let me summarize everything we've heard. Our first mistake was chronic financial problems caused by military spending, inflation and currency devaluation, an ineffective and unfair tax system, and dependence on slave labor undermined the economic base of the empire. This led to mass poverty, a decline in production, a degradation of trade relations, and the inability of the state to finance even its basic functions, including defense, which made it ineffective and unpopular. Next, we had excessive expansion and difficulties of management. The empire's vast territory became an unbearable burden, creating very big problems with control, defense, effective integration of various peoples, and logistics. This eventually led to the inevitable decentralization of power, the creation of local centers of power, and the division of the empire, which weakened its unity and ability to take thoughtful actions, especially in the face of external threats, and the changes of emperors caused by military coups and assassinations, the incessant struggle for power between different factions, and also the corruption that affected all levels of government, eroded the state institutions from within. This undermined the people's trust in the government, paralyzed the administrative system, and prevented the implementation of vital reforms, creating an atmosphere of chaos and impunity. Also, the degradation of the Roman army, which had lost its discipline, professionalism, and motivation, and its over-reliance on mercenaries and barbarian groups, coincided with increasing pressure from powerful barbarian tribes forced to migrate. This led to an inability to effectively defend the borders, a constant loss of territory and serious looting of Roman cities and provinces, which in turn caused irreparable damage. And profound changes in religious and cultural values, and especially the spread of Christianity and the weakening of traditional worship. the decline of the population due to epidemics and wars, the growing growth of social injustice, and the mass apathy of citizens affected social cohesion and the motivation to defend the empire, depriving it of internal spiritual development, a sense of common purpose, and the desire to resist. I can say that it was precisely all these reasons worked together, reinforcing each other. They were closely connected. The economic crisis weakened the army, political instability made it difficult to govern the country, and the decline of culture and society undermined the internal strength and unity of the empire. While the Western Roman Empire was collapsing under the pressure of these internal and external problems, its eastern part, namely Byzantium, managed to survive and exist for another 1,000 years. Therefore, this fact tells us that the fall was not inevitable for the entire Roman civilization. Byzantium, having a stronger economy, a centralized and stable government, and better geographical protection of its borders, was able to adapt and survive in the changed conditions, which in turn emphasizes the importance of these factors. Therefore, the lessons that can be learned from the fall of Rome remain relevant today. They remind us that even the most powerful civilizations are not immune to decline if they are not capable of constant self-analysis, adaptation to changing conditions, and timely reform. Too heavy a burden, hostility, poverty, loss of culture, and the collapse of norms can destroy even the strongest state. We now know that the history of Rome is not only a grand tale of its triumphs and achievements, but also a serious warning to modern people about how internal weaknesses, if ignored and left uncorrected, can lead to dire consequences. The fall of Rome is therefore a powerful reminder of the fragility of human achievement and the need for a constant balance between growth and stability, between expansion and effective governance, between military force and the wisdom of rulers to ensure longevity and prosperity.